I'm going to go back to recording now so that those people who are not joining us can get on here as well. And let's begin. So today, our topics are going to focus really on a wrap up. And I'm hoping to engender a little bit of conversation, a little bit of discussion today, both at the beginning and towards the end of this class. You'll sort of see how we do that. So get all of your shyness out of your system right now, so we can have a good conversation. Although I know the group here, and I know that I'm sure people will jump in. I want to talk a little bit about the context of our story here today. I want to ask the questions. One, what do we learn from the book of Job? Was God's response to Job satisfying? And ultimately, what is Job's relevance for the modern world? And that's sort of where I want to have our conversation and our discussion today. And I'm going to really open it up to all of you as well to help think about that. In terms of context, I started to hint at, was this something that was written as a historical fact? Was this something that was sort of crafted and made up as a narrative? And what I actually want to show you is where the rabbis come in on this, or at least one of the rabbis, and most of them will pick up on it as well. And this comes from the Talmud, Masechet Baba Batra, that says that one of the sages sat before Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachmani, and he sat and he said, Job never existed and was never created, i.e., there was never such a person as Job. Rather, this story was a parable. So the rabbis are not necessarily looking at this like other sections of our Tanakh as a history. They're looking at this as a story that was crafted to teach us something. And therefore, what I read from this and the way I understand this is that we should be less concerned with, well, did God actually do this? Did God actually say that? And more thinking about, what does this story teach us? What does this interaction between God and Job teach us? What are the major lessons we can learn from it? Because that's what we do with parables. We try to understand what the moral, what the lesson is. So, what do we learn from Job? Diana's asking, do they say about the book of say the same about the book of Jonah? I do not believe that they do. I think this is the only one that they say it quite in this way. So, what do we learn from Job? Before I get into sort of my thoughts, and I've got 6, 7, or 8 sort of major themes that I think we learn out of Job, I'd kind of like to hear from you. What are your thoughts? What's the lesson? What's the message that we can take away from this? Go ahead and raise your hand virtually. I see some people are doing it already, and I'll call you in the order that I see you guys. Diana, you're first.
So what's really interesting to me is I had really, I think I read the entire book of Job decades ago in college during an Old Testament class that I took. And what's really interesting to me though, is that aside, I think the way that Job is talked about and the way that the context has been really wrong. It's always been like, Job was this great man and all these things befell him and he never gave up and he always had faith and this and that. And there's sort of this whole part in the middle where he's like questioning everything. And he's like, I wish I was never born. And why did I have to even come into this? And the way that he is portrayed is sort of to the common folk is really inaccurate.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean,
and it's
through the story,
like, there goes my whole childhood. That's all I can say.
It's different. And every religion looks at it, differently. So the Orthodox and kind of in the yeshiva world looks at Job in one way.
Yeah.
In Christianity, Job is the paradigm of the suffering servant, right? And that's a paradigm that they use in a lot of different places. And
Yeah.
what was interesting is, as I was going through and trying to look at a lot of the summaries from Job, 90% of what's out there is Christian. In terms of the summaries, and because Christians look at this and read it on a much more regular basis than we as Jews do, which, by the way, was the same exact conversation for those of you who were in my Proverbs class that we said about Proverbs, right? We don't do Proverbs very much. Christians do them a lot. We don't talk about Job very much. Christians talk about it a lot. All
And
right.
the other thing I was going to say real quick was that in the end, everything comes together and he had more than he had before, and he had the replacement kids and all was good. And, it's, I guess, kind of a happy ending there, but it's pretty unrealistic. And I don't know that that's a great way to say, like, if you just believe you're going to get back everything and then some, be nice, but okay.
Yeah. Yeah. Mike, you're next. Gershon.
Thank you, Rabbi. So, yeah, I think on the surface, Job is somebody that, or the story of Job at least, is kind of looking at somebody that, praised God, but maybe was for the wrong reasons initially, right? Some of those wrong reasons were kind of incorporated in why he was praying to God and worshiping God and thanking God for everything. And then his friends who come along, it's like, maybe you shouldn't listen to people. Maybe, those people can bring you down, especially when you have some bad times, and then people say, oh yeah, well, it's not your fault. Or it is your fault. There's something that you did and maybe you haven't thought about it well enough. So then, kind of like the moral would be, in the end, that Job still didn't give up faith. I think in the end, he really didn't. And then, he did get back a good life. I mean, somebody that went from the very heights of society down to the lowest low. And like Diana said, he was willing to, he said, why am I alive? Why was I ever born? I mean, it was the worst time of his life, but then he came all the way back. So maybe, the things he thought were important really, weren't that important. And then he came back for almost, no reason. He wasn't concentrating on the right things. I kind of think about a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think this, I want to keep in mind this, going, like, he had the same as he had, like the story ends, he had the same as he had in the beginning and even more, but did he have the same worldview? And that's kind of the question, right? Of his growth through all of this. Rivka, you're up next.
I think my takeaway from Job and everything that I've listened to in this is that sometimes we can't know, or sometimes what we think we know isn't going to make sense. And that's why things happen and you can't explain them. Like what Mike was saying about sometimes your friends will come and you say, well, it's all your fault. Or they say, it's not your fault. And everybody's trying to explain it. But the bottom line, it's an uncomfortable place to be, but we can't, sometimes we just can't know.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a really important piece to this, Rivka. That's good. And you're going to see, I'm going to pick up on that later on also. Marge.
Well, a couple of thoughts. One is that everything can be gone. Everything's transient. And the one thing that might not be is your faith and your belief in God.
I like that.
And also when everything's taken away, maybe you appreciate it more. It's kind of like back to the Stoics who did like negative visualization, right? Which was like, imagine what you don't have. And So once it's all gone, maybe you'll appreciate it more.
Yeah, I mean, we know as we watch our kids grow up, you know, the things that they've risked losing or the things that they've had to work for themselves are obviously much more precious to them than the stuff that's just given to them. You know, my kids were always very, very happy to spend my money, but when they had to spend their own, all of a sudden, wait, maybe I don't really need that after all, right? It's pretty typical, pretty standard. All right, we got lots of people. Peter, then Elisheva, then Greg, or Fran. I don't know which one of you it is, but Peter first.
I keep hearing free will in this and our choices, or is it a poker game that God and Satan are playing? And I don't know. I kind of feel like at parts of the story, it's a poker game, and man's just a pawn in the whole thing. We're just disposable. We're just a throwaway hand. And then at times I hear free will coming into the choice where you have the ability to elevate yourself to a certain level to get back and find that godly spirit within you. And it's a very compelling argument that it comes around to, but it still comes down to the point of having free will and the choice to make those choices.
Right.
And that's such an interesting concept.
Yeah, I mean, that is always, people have heard me teach before that free will is fundamental and foundational to a concept of Judaism, right? Judaism doesn't work without free will, which, by the way, and some of you have heard me say, even from the Bima, that I believe that the Garden of Eden was a setup, right? We were never supposed to stay in the Garden of Eden because Torah would be meaningless in the Garden of Eden. It's only once we got kicked out that we now are, and that we know and have the choice between good and evil, that we can now choose God. And that's when the relationship becomes meaningful. Otherwise, without that choice, the relationship isn't meaningful. Elisheva.
So, three things. One, Rabbi, you organized your classes very, very well. It was so well explained and in the different stages, right? The story, the explanation. One thing that surprised me was Satan. I always thought that concept didn't exist in Judaism. So I really learned something new. And the other thing that, always worries me is what to take from this to my students. And this time, this pandemic, this virus, this lockdown really took away from them what they thought they had for granted. And they are learning a very important lesson. I mean, they will be growing with it.
Wow.
So in what proportion do you think the story, because we don't teach the story of Job, we don't read the story. As you said, we usually don't read it, or not very often. And I teach prophets, but what would you say if this is an important lesson or story in their proportion, what they can read, etc., for our children?
I think, first of all, we have to be talking about the older teens and the children, because our younger students are not going to be.
No, of course not.
But no, I think your connection with the pandemic and the fact that people have lost all of those things that were just so much a part of their lives, and it's woe is me, woe is us, and then to understand, right, that our suffering versus the people that are suffering out there. I mean, that's a great conversation to have. And it's a way to start, Job is a way to start that conversation.
I teach also the Yetzer Ra and Yetzer Tov, because I teach Jewish ethics and values. And of course, they say, oh, that's the little devil on one side, and that's the little angel on the other side.
Right.
So I think it's a good opportunity. But as you say, we have to talk about it and see in what measure or proportion we should
And I would be
talk
happy
about
to
it.
do that. I'm sure Rabbi Ern would as well, to think about, for a particular class to help you with that curriculum. Greg or Fran, and then Nancy, and then
Okay,
we'll
me.
jump ahead.
It brings to mind the expression, God's not through with you yet, because there he was, in all his glory, and then everything was taken away and then came back. So I think that it's a really good point to ponder, when it said God's not through with you yet, and here it is.
And I also thought it's like you have to hit rock bottom before you know what you're missing to do what you need to do.
Yeah, I like it. Nancy.
Okay. Okay, so a few things. One, I kind of relate this to some sense of essentialism, that, getting down to the basics, the core of what is the minimum that we actually need to live our lives. And sometimes, some people say that you have to get to that point to really then be able to develop your spiritual side. Though the form of essentialism, I can understand that in terms of material possessions. But one of the other things that happened to Job was they took away his health too. And to me, that is essential and kind of breaks the mold there, because you have to, I believe you have to have your physical and mental health in order to.
And to some degree, Nancy, I think that's what broke him in the story too, right?
Yeah.
In spite of all the tragedy and loss of his family, and I mean, that's huge. It still was the final blow was just that health and that really took that away.
And that brings up the third thing that also is a concern for me. And I think I've raised this before, that his children, his family, other people are harmed in this were harmed in this process. And that to me is not, that's not fair. That's outside the boundaries, and he loses his children, and then in the end he gets other children back, but people's lives were lost, and that's really
I think one of the reasons
hard to deal with.
Rabbis felt the need to say this was parable was for that very reason, because I think the rabbis struggled with it as well, right? The rabbis understood. The rabbis certainly had a different sense of priority of life and stuff like that than we do today. I won't deny that, but I think the rabbis really struggled with that. And by saying it's a parable, it's almost like that thing at the end of the movie. No real people were hurt in the making of this story.
Yeah.
It kind
No
of
rabbits were harmed, right?
Right. It kind of said that, and it then puts it and say, okay, what can we learn from this, as opposed to, what's really going on. Bob.
I actually have a slightly different take. I don't necessarily see the ending as a Hollywood ending where he gets back 10 more children, he gets lots of camels and this and that. I just see this as the ups and the downs of life. The money comes, the money goes, the kids thrive, the kids lose their job, the kids die, you yourself can get cancer. And you need to have a certain grounding and a certain morality and ethics and equanimity to get through life. And you need to have this despite adversity. And in even personal disease, I have seen many people with shocking personal disease who are able to enjoy life and who are able to have a wonderful worldview. And I feel that this is actually a lot of what the book is trying to teach us. And
Right.
so it's not that God's done with you and not done with you yet, and you're going to get 10 more kids. Don't worry. Sometimes the money doesn't come back, and sometimes the health doesn't recover. And yet one still has to try to um, live a meaningful life.
So I want to leave you with a thought from this part of it, and then we're going to come back to it at the end, which is, you know, why do we human beings like to watch melodrama, right? It's a particular type of entertainment. It's a particular type of experience. And there's a reason that we like to watch that. And I want to come back to that because my take on Job is a little bit like melodrama. It's not, you know, the classic, you know, villain, heroine type of, you know, all of that sort of thing. But there's aspects to it that are just about extremes. And we know that we don't live life in the extremes. So when we don't live life in the extremes, but we experience a story about extremes, what does that do for us? Right? And to me, that's kind of what melodrama does. Let me take us through some of the things that I think that we've learned from all of this. And I love what you guys said. And some of it you're going to see in what I found in all of this as well. So some broad lessons. You know, it starts with this idea, and we talked about it day one. This story is about, you know, why, you know, bad things happen to good people. Job was a good person. Bad things happen to good people. And we can try to approach that in different ways. We can try to say, well, maybe he wasn't really such a good person. Okay. Or maybe God doesn't care. Okay. Okay. You know, we talked in the beginning about theodicy and the problem of evil. Hang on. I actually, where did it go? Oh, I've got so many things on my desk right now. All right, I think I lost it. I had something that I had highlighted that I wanted to read you, but I don't have it now, so I'm going to go on. But basically,
Wing it.
Yeah, basically, it talked about theodicy and you know, the challenge, the classic formulation of the challenge of the problem of evil is, you know, that maybe God isn't either all-knowing and therefore God isn't doing stuff, or maybe God isn't all-powerful and therefore God can't do the things, right? So bad things happening to good people is a reality of the world that we see. And Job, the book of Job, deals with this head on from page one, right? We may like or dislike the way that it deals with it, but it is asking the question, which to me as a Jew means you're allowed to ask this question, right? It gives us permission to have the conversation. You can't live in this world without coming face to face with it. And whether we're talking about it on a personal scale, right, of the people that I know, or on a global scale, there were a lot of amazing people that were destroyed during the Holocaust. I mean, imagine if we had all of the Torah, all of the science, all of the fill in the blank that was destroyed during the Holocaust today, where we would be, not only as a people, but as a world, right? Why did that happen? So this book, as I said, it asks the question. It brings an answer, and we can decide if that answer is satisfying to us or not satisfying to us. But for me, the important thing as a Jew is to say, you can ask this question. That's okay. You're allowed. Oh, I lost my, there we go. The second idea is, and we read it as part of our texts, that wisdom comes from an awe of God and a turning away from evil. But it's actually the first part of the sentence that I'm a little bit more interested in. And the verse that we looked at was in Job 28:28. See, fear of the Lord is wisdom, or awe, right? Yirah is the verb, is wisdom. what does it mean to derive wisdom from awe? Right? What does it mean to derive wisdom from awe? That's a pretty big concept. It's a pretty big concept. We derive wisdom from learning. We derive wisdom from respect, maybe. Okay, maybe awe is an extension of respect. We derive wisdom from experience. There's a lot of things that we derive wisdom from. But to derive wisdom from awe means I am not the end-all be-all in the world. Because if I believe that, well, in order to have awe, I can't believe that. I need to have some humility. I need to know my place, so to speak, in the hierarchy of the world and of what goes on, and to be able to say there are things that are greater, bigger, more magnificent than I am. That's a powerful lesson. And we see that lesson to some degree in the response, in God's response. Who are you? Who are you to question me? Obviously, whether or not we agree with this, disagree with this, the message of Job is God is in control. We may think we're in control, but we're really not. Now we're in control, and this, Peter, is going to our conversation of free will, right? We're in control of our responses. We're in control of our actions, but we're not really in control. You know, I kind of see the book, you know, the book of Job is like, for those people who grew up in Disneyland or Disney World, it's like Autopia, right? You may think you're driving, and you are. You're pushing the gas pedal and you're taking your foot off the gas pedal, but you're not going anywhere that's not on that track. And the speed on which you go, you know, is up to you, but where you're going may not be. And that is a piece of all of this. And I find this as a modern person both to be challenging and freeing at the same time. It's complex. I can't remember who said this, whether it was Peter, I can't remember, somebody was talking, I think it was Mike Derschlag, it was Mike who was talking about the Friends, right? You know, the friends dropped the ball here. They did not do what they needed to do. So much so that God chided them for it, especially at the end, pulled these friends in and said, you guys failed. And we recognize the fact that, you know, we join together as a community. We join together to support one another, but our friends and our human beings are as fallible as we are, and as limited and finite as we are. And it's unfair of us to expect that they're going to have all the answers, because they don't. They may have some answers. They may help us see some answers. They may open up a perspective we haven't seen before, but to depend on them to say, oh, you've got all the answers, and that's not fair either. And we sort of see that in the book of Job. And I mean, Job's response was so classic in all of this, you know, when they were sort of trying to convince him of all of this, you know, yeah, I've heard of these things. You're mischievous comforters. You know, you're not doing a great job at this. We definitely have this idea of, even in the midst of suffering, not to lose hope. And that is a major component of the book of Job. And there are many people who are going through challenges and trials in their life who read the book of Job and actually see inspiration. There are other people who are going through trials in their life and read the book of Job and really, really have a crisis of faith because they're trying to put a context on their own suffering and they can't do it through the book of Job. So it can go either way. But this idea that in the midst of suffering, we shouldn't lose hope is a major part of all of this. And it's actually so much so that we have a scribal problem in the original text. The verse, Job 13:15, he may well slay me, yet I have hope. I will argue my case before him, is that classic expression of hope in Job. But if you look at the Hebrew, there are two different words low here, right? And it completely changes the meaning. Yet I have hope is this low in the brackets. And it's actually lu, right? Not even low. But this low means no, I will not have hope. And at some point in time, the scribe made the mistake of changing it from this low to this low, which really changed the meaning to the absolute opposite of the text. And so now we have what's called a ktav and kri, which means this stuck in the writing, but we read it and we understand it as this low. The sixth lesson that I get out of this, and now we're getting a little bit more spiritual, a little more pastoral, right, is even in silence, God's presence is with us. One of the things that we felt as we read through the book of Job is the absence of God for Job, right? God was distant. God was silent. God let Satan sort of do Satan's thing, and Job was sort of flailing. And it wasn't until the end that God showed up. But there wasn't a dialogue. There wasn't that sense of presence. There wasn't that sense of connection and conversation that we have in so many other places in the Bible. And the silence is deafening, right, in the book of Job. And yet we have this sense that it's the presence of God that Job still feels, even in the midst of silence, that allows Job to continue as long as he does. And it's something that, I learned very, very early on as a hospital chaplain. And sometimes there are no words, but just being there is enough for somebody. And that, we call it in chaplaincy, it's called the ministry of presence, right? We're just there and we're holding their hand and we're just walking through that, wherever they are with them. We don't say anything. We don't try to answer any questions because we don't have the answers either, but we're willing to be there with you through it. And to me, that strength, that idea is something that I try to bring to people who really are in moments of struggle, of this understanding that you're not alone, that presence of God can be there as a source of strength. One of the places that I saw this in the book of Job, and it is in these verses, but God knows the way I take. When he has tried me, I shall emerge as pure as gold. I have followed in God's tracks, kept God's ways without swerving. I have not deviated from what his lips have commanded. I have treasured his words more than my daily bread. This idea that Job is still holding on to that presence of God in spite of all of this is very powerful. And I don't know if there's a last or the second to last, the imagery of of God speaking to Job from the midst of the whirlwind, from the midst of the storm, has always been an incredibly powerful image for me, right? Where do we hear God? Sometimes we hear God in the quiet moments in our life, but we also need to be able to hear God in those chaotic, stormy moments in our lives and still be able to hear God's voice. And that to me really is the idea of presence in the midst of challenge, right? Even though the storm is there, God is still in the storm. God is still there. And that storm is destructive. That storm is uprooting. That storm is doing all sorts of things, but God's presence is still there. To me, it brings strength and courage. Peter asked a message to me offline, do I see this as a book of hope? I see this as a book that allows us to hope. I don't necessarily see it as a book of hope, but it's a book that allows us to hope. It opens the door to it, Peter. It's a good question. And then at the end of this, right, we sort of talked about the ending. This is sort of a classic, much more classic Jewish lesson. After repentance and forgiveness comes blessing, right? When we do something wrong, when we are on the wrong track in our lives and things are bad, and we can understand this in two ways. We can understand this from a theological perspective to say, well, God is going to give us blessing. That may be. Or we can also understand it that when we pick ourselves up, when we get ourselves from out of the depths of misery, we recognize and see the blessings in our lives that we may never have seen before, or we may have forgotten about. And so whether it's God is giving us blessing, or when we go through this process and we come out the other end, we're open to seeing blessings, that's a powerful message. And obviously we talked about this at the end, of Job, and thus the Lord blessed the latter years of Job more than the former. Bob, I see your hand going up. Go ahead.
Well, when we're talking about hope, it's not necessarily that you're going to get all your camels back and you're going to get 10 more kids. I think the hope is that somehow or other we're going to be able to successfully live in our decline. We can somehow live and, as you say, get the strength to carry on despite adversity. The adversity may or may not go away, but with hope and God's blessing, we may be able to continue to satisfactorily live with it. And I think that's sort of a reasonable thought.
I agree. I like that. So what I'm bringing to you now is 3 paragraphs from the introduction of JPS's translation of the book of Job. JPS is Jewish Publication Society. It's actually pretty dense. I'm going to read through it quickly, and I'm going to highlight the ideas that I want to bring out of it. But it sort of sets for me a really important framework. This is at the introduction, and I'm using it at the end because I felt like if I said this at the beginning, we wouldn't need the class. So because everybody would see this is what we're doing. So Job is talking about, they talk here about the religious sensibility apparently absorbs or even affirms the contradiction embodied in these books. They're talking about what Job does. And they're talking about the fact that Job is a very contradictory book, and we saw that. That may be because these contradictions are perceived to exist in reality. One of the most important questions. Why is Job such a difficult and contradictory book? Because we actually see these contradictions in the world around us, right? One can see in an individual life or in individual life as collective life a moral causality, right? Things happen for a reason. Evil recoils upon the evildoers, whether individual or collective goodness brings blessings. By the way, this isn't written very well. I didn't love it, but I'm taking it as it is. So on the one hand, we see there's, evil comes to evil, good comes to good. But then it's turned on its head in Job because Job is good and the evil is now coming onto Job. So how does that work? At the same time, the other side of it is the manifestation of this causality can be so erratic or delayed as to cast doubt on its validity as the single key to the destiny of man and nation. So yeah, we can say that good things come to good people, but we don't see it. We see these bad people thriving and these good people dying. And well, so maybe it's delayed. Maybe we can argue it's in the world to come, but it still creates the problem now. Hence, the sober believer does not pin his faith solely on a simple axiom of divine maintenance of moral causality, but neither will he altogether deny its force. No single key unlocks the mystery of destiny. And to me, this is one of the major lessons of Job. As much as Job is sort of a single story, it's all about the fact that there is no single answer here. Within our ken is neither the tranquility of the wicked nor the suffering of the righteous. Comes from Pirkei Avot. But for all that, I'm on this bottom paragraph, the sober believer does not endorse nihilism. Wisdom, Torah, and prophets continue to represent for him one aspect of causality in events, which he can confirm in his own private experience. So in spite of the fact that everything sort of seems to be willy-nilly at the whim of God and Satan, we still bring wisdom and Torah and our prophets as our guide for how we try to navigate all of this. But one aspect only. It's only one aspect of what it is that we look for. The other stands beyond moral judgment, though it is still under God, namely the mysterious or preordained decree of God, towards which the proper attitude is, though he slay me, I will yet trust him. So in Job, we have, in essence, a conflict between God gives evil to evil and good to good, and yet that's not happening here. And that's what Torah and wisdom and all of that says to us. And yet, at the same time, there are things that are out of our control, that is mysterious, or we can't figure out, and we have to be okay with that. We have to be okay with that. And to me, that is a major part of the book of Job. Being okay with not having an answer. As we go to the final sort of thing here is God's response satisfying? Job gets an answer, but many of our commentators say clearly God's not really answering Job's question. And are we okay with that? And ultimately, what's the relevance for the modern world? And I want to spend maybe about 5 or 10 minutes just talking about these two questions and hearing your thoughts on this as well, right? Was the response satisfying? What's the relevance? What does it mean? Peter, I saw your hand go up. It really is helpful not to raise your hand like this because I may not see it if I'm not looking. So please use your virtual hands. But Peter, I did see you. Go ahead.
I think we all, at some point, live the book of Job ourselves. I was very ill in June, 2 weeks from dying, they told me. And when you face those challenges, you have to wonder why you've been chosen to go on versus other people who don't. And it's a challenge that humanity faces on a daily basis. I didn't expect to have heart problems after they fixed it 15 years ago. We all face these challenges, whether we realize it or not. And this whole story has had so much meaning to me. And it's really hard to articulate what Job went through because we can't be in that position until we face it. Until we face that challenge, we don't know how we're going to react.
Yeah, it's true. Thank you,
And
Peter.
that's the hardest part of this. Was it a satisfying answer? No. Why did I get sick? I still will never know. And we're not supposed to. We're just supposed to pick up and learn something from it and endure. And as I said before, this is an opportunity that COVID gave me the opportunity to learn from you. And I find your teaching to be very brilliant, on this. And it really means a lot.
Thank you, Peter. First of all, thank you for that. And you raise a question that I really agree, or a response that I really agree is the answer satisfying? No. And are we okay being unsatisfied, right? The hubris of us to say, I need to be satisfied with the answer is actually quite incredible if we think about it that way, right? What gives us the right, to some degree, that's what God is saying. Who are you to think that you can understand? We're not going to. We can't understand. The finite cannot understand the infinite. But the question is, what do we do with that? What do we do with that? Maimonides, at one point in time, talks about the fact that the second you try to define God, you're wrong, because God is indefinable. Well, then we have a choice. We can either say, well, I'm never going to understand God, so I'm not going to try. Or I can say, I can work to broaden my own experience to understand more and as much of God as I possibly can. That's my goal. I'm not going to understand everything, but I'm going to spend my life trying to understand as much as I can. And that's what Maimonides says, and that's what Maimonides guides us to do. Rivka.
You're muted, Rivka.
Oh, you're still muted.
Okay,
There you go.
thank you. I just want to throw a wrench in this gear and say, personally, for me, his answer is very satisfying.
Okay.
Because I'm the kind of person that I want to know. I want to know. I want to know why. I want to know how. I want to know. I want to know. And I'll drive myself crazy sometimes because I can't figure it out. And it's almost, I mean, when you said earlier about it's freeing, the book of Job is a little bit freeing. I can relax because I don't have to know. I can't know, and my mind may have that, but we're all struggling and wrestling and trying to figure this out and figure that out. And did God mean this? And is he like that? Or is he like this? And sometimes it's okay to not, I mean, I said this earlier, but sometimes it's okay to just not know. And it's okay to relax with that,
It's an uncomfortable
It's
of God for many people, but
yeah.
it's part of it, and it's okay.
Yes.
Diana.
So I think it's a little off track, but not too much. You were saying that the book of Job is something that really works for some people to hold on to during difficult times. And like a lot of people here have articulated, that it shows that just, bad things happen and it's out of our control, and you can choose to believe in God. You can choose to have faith, which he did. For me, I find that during difficult times, it's a lot easier for me to turn to Tehillim, to the Psalms. Maybe because they're more like sound bites, but you can kind of pick the one, okay, which is the one that's going to go talk about faith. And then there's like 27 that talks about the awe and the fear, and it's almost like a Spark Notes version of this in a way.
Right.
But I think the idea is just knowing that you're just, as much as we think we're in control, and we try to be in control, and we try to mitigate, this sentence when we go to services, but to teshuva and tefillah and tzedakah will mitigate the decree, and these are really good things to hang on to. And I think if the book of Job is something that works for people and it's going to bring them comfort, then it's great.
Everybody finds everybody finds different places comforting and meaningful and whatever, depending on their own.
And then the other quick thing is, maybe like, as somebody else pointed out, Elisheva, with the pandemic, we're sort of like all Job right now. Every time we go out, it's a leap of faith, like that we're going to be safe. We're going to be safe here, there, that the vaccine is going to work and all that stuff. So in a way, this is, I would say, a very collective time, rather than Job that was singular. So we could almost take Job from that singular to the plural context and be in this space together. And I think specifically this space has been awesome. So thank you.
Sure. So, to me, Job is responding to one aspect of God. When I teach about God, and a couple of you have taken my Basic Judaism class, when I teach about it at Basic Judaism, when I teach about it at TNT for our 7th graders, I teach about God in 4 texts, right? 4 different texts. The first one comes from the book of Genesis, right? In the image of God, we were created. This idea of God as creator, as that which made us who we are, and that we share some similarity with God through this idea of B'Tselem Elohim. Maybe not a physical image, maybe it's a spiritual image, but we share that similarity with God. The second source that I teach is from the book of Leviticus, Kedoshim Tihiyu Ki Kadoshani, you shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy. The fact that God is this source of holiness, and that we can take some of that. We are holy because of the choices that we make and the things that we do by choosing to be like God, right? The third source is the source that I see as the book of Job. And the third source that I teach comes from the Talmud. And it is a story of, it's a Roman emperor, that comes to a rabbi and says, show me your God. And the rabbi says, well, you can't see him. And the rabbi says, I want to see your God. And the rabbi says, okay, look up at the sun. And the emperor says, I can't look up at the sun. And the rabbi says, well, the sun, if you can't look up at the sun, who's just one of God's servants, how do you think you can look at God? This idea of God being distant, God being so grand that we just can't fully understand, is Job, right? That's the response from Job. And it is an aspect of our theology because we're not going to understand everything. And then we've talked about this already. We're not going to understand everything. We're not going to have the answers, right? And there are things that happen in this world that we want the answers to, right? Just this week, I am dealing with a young woman who was just diagnosed with stage 4 ovarian cancer, and I'm dealing with a child who's below the age of 10 who just went on to hospice, right? And there's no answer for that. There's nothing that I can say to answer why that is happening to that person. But Job doesn't ask us to answer it. Job asks the friends who don't do such a good job to be present. Job shows God's presence in the midst of the storm and in the midst of the chaos, right? Job is coming at this from a different perspective and a different direction. And it's not the easy one because the other ones are easier, right? But it's part of it. It's an acceptance of our limitations and then a desire to say, in spite of those limitations, I'm going to move forward. The last one, by the way, just so people know, is another source from Talmud that talks about that we can emulate God. We're supposed to emulate God, and just as God clothed the naked, so should we clothe the naked. And just as God visited the sick, so too should we visit the sick. And this idea that we can be godly and bring God into this world by our actions, to me, is the fourth aspect of our relationship and theology with God. But Job is that third piece. Job is that third piece. And it's hard, but it's important because it allows us, it brings us down a level. It allows us to interact with people and interact with God with a certain sense of humility. Any questions or any more comments on this?
I just want to thank you, Rabbi, for saying all those thoughts that are in my head so much better than me.
No worries. No worries. So I didn't do it intentionally, but you know how sometimes things work out just the way they're supposed to. you know, it really works for me that the next class I'm going to be teaching, there's going to be a 2-week break, which I'm going to tell you what's going to happen during the 2-week break. But at the beginning of April, right, the first Tuesday in April, April 6th, we are going to start our next class, which is going to be on the spirituality of Heschel. And to me, Heschel is going to come at a relationship with God totally different than Job. Totally different than Job, right? It's going to be intimate. It's going to be personal. It's going to be active and vibrant, and all of these sorts of things that we sort of saw lacking with Job. Heschel is going to bring in just the opposite. Diana's asking, do I have any recommended reading for the class? Look, there's a lot of recommended reading for Heschel. The 3 top that I would say, right, if you want to read Heschel, Heschel is very difficult to read. It's very dense. He's a philosopher. He's really tough. But if you want to read Heschel, I recommend God in Search of Man and Man in Search of God. They're 2 books that I would recommend, either one of them. And then the Sabbath, right? It's a small book, but don't let its size fool you. It's very dense and very complex. But Heschel really broad. We'll talk about it. We'll read selections from all of these sorts of things. And then at the end, Diana, you may have a better sense of which book you like the best, and you may want to dive into. But Heschel really, we've spoken about him. We've talked about him at the beginning. We talked about racism and tolerance in terms of his interaction and engagement with the African-American community and civil rights and all of that. But now we're going to speak about it in terms of his spirituality. So that starts April 6th, but what's going to happen these next 2 weeks? Because we don't want to have, downtime. We don't want to have, a break here. Come on. Many of you know that Betham Cafe, which is our movie nights, was something that we've really sort of lost out on because of COVID. We can't get all together. We can't watch the movie and have the discussions that we've been having over the last few years. And we really haven't found a way to everybody watch a movie via Zoom all at the same time. It doesn't work. So what we're going to do instead is we are going to encourage people to watch a movie or watch something on your own, and then we'll have a conversation about it together. So what we're going to do these next 2 weeks is we're going to encourage people to watch the series Unorthodox. Unorthodox. Many of you have seen it. You can find it on Netflix. We're going to encourage you to watch the first 2 episodes of Unorthodox, and then next Tuesday at 7:30 we'll talk about it, and then the last 2 episodes of the first season of Unorthodox. There's actually another season coming out, is what I'm hearing, and we'll talk about those 2. But it's a very, very interesting series, and given what's going on now in Israel with the ultra-Orthodox and the progressive movements and all of that, having a conversation about unorthodox is going to be really, I think, fruitful. So we're going to enjoy that. And then moving on to the spirituality of Heschel. For those who are interested in Jewish history, my Basic Judaism class next week at 6:30, we are starting Basic Judaism 3, which is a survey of Jewish history. And you're welcome to sign up for that and join that as well. So lots of things going on. Lots of things going on. All right. Everyone, be safe, be healthy.
Thank you.
Thank you. When you're done, get your shot.
Have a nice night, everybody.
Thank you,
so
Rabbi.
So much. This is
Thank you.
wonderful.
You have to turn the
Thank
clock
you. It was
back.
a good
you.
class.
You, Rabbi.
Bye.
Knock 'em dead.
Oh, Rabbi, one
Yes,
thing.
Peter.
You know, your wife is actually doing the cooking class at our synagogue in Summit.
Yes, I know that. I'll be the cameraman.
Behind the scenes, huh?
Behind the scenes, yes. I do know that she's doing the cooking class.
My
for you.
wife sent me the thing from Sisterhood, and I go, wow, that's Debbie.
It is Debbie. And she's doing something this week for our women's circle here at Betham, Moroccan, and she's doing, I think she's got like 5 classes next week. So She's
By the
busy.
way, those pickles came out great.
Oh, good.
The
I'm glad.
harissa pickles came out incredible.
Good.
My son loved them. Oh,
All right,
but
everyone.
no, thank you so much. It
Bye.
was a great class.
Thank you.
Good night.